Okay, so I think it's time for us to kick off the event. So thank you very much for coming and joining this event after the withdrawal. What lies ahead for Afghanistan? I'm the moderator for the event, Hans Tong of National Taiwan University, and also the executive member for the Research Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. So let me begin the event just with some remarks, and then we'll have Mrs. Nazifa for a very wonderful talk today. So I guess while most of our attention now still concentrates on the pandemic and ongoing war in Ukraine, let's not forget less than a year ago, the U.S. decision to withdraw from Afghanistan before the Taliban takeover shocked the entire world. And the withdrawal and the aftermath leave several questions unanswered. For example, what has happened to Afghanistan since the withdrawal, both socially and politically? And what kind of new geopolitics for the region and the world have been developing since then? And of course, for us here in Taiwan, I guess more importantly, even though the country, Afghanistan, is more than 3,000 miles away from Taiwan geographically, but what does the withdrawal mean to Taiwan's own security situation? And this is, of course, also another question I would like to discuss today. These questions actually, it behoove us, humanities and social sciences scholars, to answer all of them. And today, we are very fortunate to have Mrs. Nazifa Alizada from Vida Institute to talk to us. So let me, of course, give you a very brief introduction to her and also her background. Nazifa is originally from Afghanistan, and she's currently working as operations and outreach manager at the Varieties of Democracy, Vida Institute, at the University of Gothenburg. She has previously worked with various research projects in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, South Korea, and Sweden. And she holds a master's degree in global studies from the University of Gothenburg, and also her BA in politics, philosophy, and economics, with double minors in gender studies and Asian studies from Asian University for Women in Bangladesh. So without further ado, let's welcome Nazifa Alizada for her presentation. And I think Nazifa will be talking for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we can start our Q&A session. So the floor is yours, Nazifa.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining. I will just share my screen so you see my PowerPoint. Can you see it?
Oh, yes, very clear.
Okay, yeah, great. So as this event is after the withdrawal, what lies ahead for Afghanistan? And I thought I would start with discussing a few of the myths or the common narratives which exist around the withdrawal and then the collapse of the Afghan government before going on to the question and discussing it, because we cannot really know what lies ahead in the future if we do not really understand what has happened. So there are quite a set of narratives that has been going on around for quite some time. And number one of those is Afghanistan fell in 10 days, which is, I would say, a lot of these common narratives not only are misleading, but in some cases are even incorrect and gives such a wrong image of the whole situation. So it is really important to address them and understand them. I would address this first common narrative by looking at the whole 20 years or the past 2 decades when the US was in Afghanistan, but with a particular focus on 2009 until 2021, when there were a lot of developments. And then we'll also look at why did the Afghan government collapse. And then the second narrative, which is quite common, is that Afghans did not fight. So to address this, then we look at then who fought if Afghans did not fight. And we'll also look at the 20 years context here. And then once we know the answer to the first question, then we will also look at why what happened. in August in Afghanistan. The third common narrative which is there is that Taliban have changed, or there is Taliban 0.2, or Taliban have softened, that they have moderated. This is also misleading in so many ways and leads to a lot of, has a lot of policy implications. So it's really important to look at this. And we will look or challenge this by looking at the human rights situation in Afghanistan, women's rights, minority rights, and few things like that. And lastly, we will go through the question of what lies ahead. And this, I would like to look at this into one from the Afghans, the locals, the citizens' perspective, what lies ahead for Afghans themselves, and then what lies ahead for the Taliban, because as easy as it is to say that it is the same, they are really different, and they could have really different situations. And then at last, I also would have some recommendations on how we could help in personal level as well as more broader in the policy level. So the common narrative number one is that Afghanistan fell in 10 days. If we just following 15th August, if we look at any or majority of the headlines on bigger newspapers such as BBC, The Guardian, New York Times, and a lot of politicians have also been talking about this, that Afghanistan fell in 10 days, or it fell within a week, or it happened in such a speed that everybody was shocked or everybody was surprised. And these narratives are really, for me personally, this narrative itself is surprising, because I'm like, how could this anybody not see this coming, and why is this surprising? Because we cannot really analyze this whole situation just by looking at the last 10 days, as they claim that it fell in 10 days. We need to look at the context and how the situation has developed leading to those last 10 days. And eventually to the collapse of the Afghan government. So the US has been present in Afghanistan from 2001 until 2021. And major developments, I would like to, just for the interest of time, I would like to start from 2009, when Obama has renewed his commitment to Afghanistan. He said that he's going to deploy additional troops to Afghanistan. By this time, there were 60 to 68,000 US troops plus NATO in Afghanistan. And he announced that he's gonna renew his commitment, meaning that he will deploy even more troops to train Afghan army, as well as he would also renew his strategy in the sense that he will start to measure how the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban is going on the ground. He deployed more troops, and by the end of December 2019, there were around 100,000 US troops in Afghanistan, US plus NATO. 2011 was announced as July 2011, Obama announced that this is going to be the beginning of the withdrawal for the US. This will not happen quickly, but it will be a gradual process, and this is the beginning of withdrawal. So it started from July 2011. And then at the meantime, he announced that there is going to be some sort of peace negotiations with the Taliban. So as they withdraw, on the parallel side, the peace negotiations with the Taliban and US and the Afghan government will be going on. By June 2013, there have been developments on that front. So Taliban managed to convince US and Qatar to open an international office in Doha. And this gives them quite a lot of advantage in the sense that it gives them some sort of international presence for the first ever time since their government was overthrown in 2001. So this international presence gives them both the stage and the voice and the platform to lobby for themselves and then get more funds, and also have a voice and talk more often in the international level. By December 2014, US withdraws most of its troops, but leaves 9,800 of the troops behind. And that's meant to be, according to initial plan, it was meant to stay until 2016 only. So for another 2 years, and majority of these troops are staying there to train the Afghan army. So that was the main objective by that time. It's also important that, to mention that in 2014, in Afghanistan, there was the presidential election, and Ashraf Ghani, who left or fled the country in August 2021, he was elected as the president. And then in February 2019, there is tremendous progress between US and the Taliban when in terms of negotiations. They start the talks that there will be some sort of negotiation or some sort of deal where the US will completely withdraw in exchange for the Taliban to sit in the negotiation table with the Afghan government. And this deal, after 1 year back and forth with Qatar and their office in Doha, the deal is signed in February 2021 between Khalilzad, US Special Envoy to Afghanistan, and Mullah Baradar, which is the Taliban representative on this. It's a 4-page deal. And what it says is that US will withdraw all its troops within 14 months by the time this deal is signed. In exchange for this, the Taliban will start or sit with the Afghan representatives for an intra-Afghan peace talk. And more importantly, the Taliban prisoners will be released from the prisons. And also Afghanistan will not be used as a territory from where attacks could happen against the US. So these are the main parts of this deal. And maybe I should also say that this deal is usually called in the most of international media and also by a lot of US politicians, it's called as the peace deal. But what I would like to call it, it's more a withdrawal deal between the US and the Taliban, because there is no mention of peace as such, or no implications of peace in this deal. So it's more like US withdraws in exchange for the Taliban to get what they want. In March 2020, 5,000 Taliban prisoners are released according to this deal. And then the plan is also that another 1,000 will be released in the months following that. And then in the next 3 months, almost more and more of their prisoners will be released from the prisons in Afghanistan. In August 2021, the Afghan government, on 15th August, the Afghan government collapses. Ashraf Ghani, who was the president, he runs away. And then the Taliban, who are on the gates of Kabul, they just enter to the presidential palace and claim their government. So this is how this happened. And now, having this timeline of how the US withdrawal has happened, now it's also important to look at, so why this happened. I would like to start by saying that this is really such a complex situation, and the why cannot be answered here and now, because there is just so much that we don't know about this. There is just so much that we don't really know what happened on August 15th. Why did the president run away? Did he run away to save himself? Did he run away to save his people? Was he under pressure by a lot of people? What exactly happened? There is a lot of secret data on this and a lot of confidential data that are not released yet, and we don't exactly know what caused all of this. So we are yet to figure out. It's so easy to put the blame on one individual and say that this person ran away, so this happened, or just put the blame on somebody somewhere, which is an easy way out. But I would say there is just so much we don't know about this. But of the things that we do know that have contributed to this whole situation, one is that the Taliban grew as the US and NATO troops kept pulling back since 2014, especially. So as they continued to withdraw from the country, the Taliban just kept capturing more places. Even before the Taliban have had their government in Afghanistan again, and in August, they have already claimed by then 40 to 50% of Afghanistan. They have had their government and their rule, and especially in rural areas and most of the highways and the distances between major provinces. They have blocked the highways, and in some areas they even collected taxes from people, and that's how they funded themselves. So these are the things that have really gone invisible in so many ways, but they have had huge gains even before the 15th, before this August victory. So this has contributed quite a lot to making this whole situation much easier for them. And then the US Taliban Doha deal, which happened in February 2020, this contributed quite a lot, because in exchange for this, they have got the chance to lobby more in the international sphere, but they have also got quite a lot of visibility, which also led to their normalcy in so many ways. And more importantly, through this, they had the leverage on the US. So they would put leverage on them telling to release our prisoners. And this increased their number. And among these prisoners were most of their high-ranking Taliban officials, most of the high-ranking people on their ranks and commanders that they have who had important decision-making power within Taliban. And once they were released, of course, their power just increases and gets more. So when the US and when the Taliban kept growing, US kept withdrawing, what happened in the process was that the Afghan government was excluded from this whole process. For one, the whole deal happened between the US and the Taliban without any sort of support or inclusion of the Afghan government or Afghan representatives, which was a pure mistake, because if there is ever gonna be peace in the country, you cannot do it without involvement of the Afghan people. The second part is that the Afghan government was really corrupt, and it was struggling with a lot of different problems that it could not focus on all these other things going on at the same time. So the Afghan government was corrupt in all levels, starting with the president up until the very lowest officers and majority of the Afghan government offices. So most of them were self-serving, and it was really difficult to just rule a government with that level of corruption in the government bodies. The power was in Afghanistan is really centralized. What people in Afghanistan call the government in Afghanistan is the Republic of Three, very common people, and that is just to say that the government is ruled by three people and nobody else's decision means anything. So that centralized power has also contributed to this whole situation. And on top of this, there is a really weak parliament. So the parliament is really divided and doesn't really have much say on what the government does. So overall, with all of this together, I think it makes it much more clear to see that this government could not sustain, even it was so difficult to see how it sustained until now. So it was really, I would say it was more predictable than a shock for most of the people. It should have been more predictable than a shock to see this coming. Looking at the timeline of the withdrawal and the power balance between the US and the Taliban, with US just withdrawing, the Taliban growing in number. So this was really a sensible outcome. And this begs the question of, so was the US just so ignorant of the realities on the ground in Afghanistan and it didn't see this coming? Or did they know that this was happening and still did not care enough about the outcome? So did they just want to leave at any cost? So this is a question which needs to be answered, and maybe a lot of it depends on what comes next on the data and what becomes available, so we know much better what happened. So the second myth or common narrative around this whole collapse situation is that Afghans did not fight. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. This is part of the speech that Joe Biden gave on following the withdrawal from Afghanistan and all the mess which was at the Kabul airport. He just defended his decision and said that, put the whole blame on the Afghan army, saying that they don't have the will to fight. And then as we see, major newspapers also just picked up the line, and it was just common to say that Afghans just left their Afghan army did not fight enough, or they were not willing to sacrifice for their country. And this is just so easy to put the blame on them. But let's look at who fought then if the Afghan army did not. So this is the 20 years of the data from the last 20 years. It shows the number of Afghan military and police. There were around 67,500 sacrifices as of April 2021. The opposition fighters, or the Taliban, their sacrifice numbers were 51,000. And Afghan civilians were the third largest group of people who were sacrificed in this war, and there were 47,000. And then it's the US contractors, military, and everybody, the NATO and other foreign civilians. So if you look at the numbers, this really just explains that Afghans have fought in this war for 20 years and they have made major sacrifices. So 90% of this whole sacrifice was by the Afghan people. And what this data does not include is also that there were quite a lot of US airstrikes or US plus NATO allies airstrikes in Afghanistan during this past 20 years as well, which consistently killed Afghan civilians, children, and basically a lot of people in the southern areas. And even though not many talk about it, there are quite a lot of sacrifices Afghans made. Both they were killed both by the Taliban and by the US and international forces in that way. So what I'm saying is that the Afghan army has fought for 20 years, and it's just so incorrect to say that they have not fought. So if they have fought and they were good enough, so why what happened? As mentioned earlier, 40 to 50% of the country, especially the rural areas, were at the hands of the Taliban by the time this happened. So this wasn't something which happened overnight. This didn't happen in 10 days. And it's not that the army just left the country or they just gave up on it in one day. This was a process which happened over 20 years. Again, we come back to the question, the fact that the Afghan government was so corrupt. And this corruption is even worse when it comes to the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense in Afghanistan. So often it was that food supplies and weapons and other equipment, it was stolen by people and the government way before it reached the soldiers on the front line. So the soldiers would be left without any equipment, food and supplies, but because everything was already just stolen by the officials. And then these things which were stolen, they would be sold illegally in the black market, and then they eventually reached the hands of the Taliban, a lot of anti-government forces. The second part is also that due to this corruption, there was a lot of ghost soldiers in Afghanistan. And what we mean by that is that by the time the collapse, by April 2021, it is said that there were 300,000 Afghan forces, so entirely. But how many of these were real people and how many of these were just names on the paper, we don't really know. The widespread corruption just makes it impossible to know, but it is said that the number of forces might have been much lesser than what it's said. And then the frequent change of commanders, police officers, governors, and those who were in decision-making powers when it applied to all the soldiers on the front line, that was also another factor which contributed to this. So since the power was so centralized, the president could just decide that, okay, I changed this commander today, or I changed this governor today. And all of a sudden that made the whole situation so unstable because the whole power rank and everything changes all of a sudden and within such a short time. So that also contributes to the whole situation. And Taliban had control of highways and the ways between major provinces. So when there was a war going on, even if the government managed to send supplies, most of it would be taken by the Taliban on the way. So they would block all the supplies on the way. And that's also another factor. Second part would be poor leadership and lack of trust on Ashraf Ghani's government. So a lot of people did not read. So a lot of people or soldiers on the front line had a hard time trusting his leadership and fighting for him as such, because during the previous years, there were so often that the soldiers were just left on the front lines without any equipment, without food, without supplies. They would call for backup, but they would never receive anything. And they would, at the end, Taliban would take over that district and lead to major failures, and the soldiers would be killed in big numbers. So with that history of the government, it was really difficult for the soldiers to trust Ashraf Ghani's government and his backup when they were in need. So this was one of the major factors within the Afghan government. And the other part was the betrayal by the US, because when they decided to withdraw from Afghanistan, the Afghan soldiers, the Afghan National Army was still really dependent on the US, both in terms of logistics and supplies. But when they withdrew, that meant also a reduction of supplies and funds in so many ways. And during this whole time, they did not really entirely become independent, so to lead these kind of operations. And that's something which has not been discussed before as well. The other one was also the Doha deal. So in Afghanistan, it is this history that US has had a lot of influence, and people in general have lost this trust in the government and had more belief in the influence of the US when it comes to decision making. So for example, people would go and vote, and regardless of what they voted for, the US would come and decide that, okay, you build a unity government, and that would be it. So it's the same here. Because the Doha deal was signed by the US, a lot of people would already be asking, so why should we fight if the US has already decided that they're going to hand over the government to the Taliban? So the why to fight, that part was really unclear for the people because of this Doha deal and the huge US influence during this whole time. So to majority of the people, it felt like it's a decision which is already made. There is no reason that we get killed in the process as well, because whether we get killed or not, this is done already. So the third common narrative here is that Taliban have changed. This is something you might have heard quite a lot as well. There is Taliban point 2, Taliban have moderated, Taliban have softened. And this also made a lot of headlines in a lot of newspapers, and you have been used by so many policymakers and even in academia. But maybe if we look at the human rights situation in Afghanistan at the moment, then this question will be explained by itself. So this graph is from the Vidam Institute, and it shows the top 20 changing indicators in the Liberal Democracy Index in Afghanistan from 2020 to 2021. It shows all the changes which happened there. And if we look at all these 20 indicators, it just shows that everything has just got much worse since the government has collapsed. So of these ones, major one is freedom of press. Media is controlled by the Taliban. Censorship rates are just high. There is no expression of anti-Taliban opinion in the media or by the media. The journalists just get killed, tortured, imprisoned, detained arbitrarily for merely doing their jobs, for taking a picture of an incident which has happened somewhere, for covering a news which could harm the Taliban's image. And the number of journalists present in Afghanistan has reduced a lot since then as well. The second part is civil society. The civil societies, majority of them have been abolished, partly because a lot of these civil societies were so reliant on funding from international organizations as well as from the government. And once the US troops left together with the rest of the world, then the funding was cut, and the majority of these civil society organizations could not sustain anymore. The second part is the ideology. So majority of them have been working for democracy building, cultural events, and similar kind of things, which are in contrast with Taliban's ideology and is not acceptable anymore. So they had no way but to stop whatever they're doing. And the third part is the fear by the Taliban. So majority of the people working with civil society, they ended up living in hiding, or they have just left because they fear that the Taliban might come back and seek revenge from these people because of their association or earlier activities. Mobilization and protest, it is banned unless they get permission from the Taliban, and that really is quite symbolic. So that means you can protest, but then we have seen that quite a lot of protests where women protested in Kabul with the permission, then it ended up being really violent, and Taliban used force against them to just stop them. Judiciary and justice system, just based on the news on social media and different videos that we see coming out of the context, it is that majority of the Talibs, they consider themselves as the judge, as the liar, and pass on the sentence altogether by themselves without really any formal process that anybody could go through this. And then minority rights is as it is at its worst as well. Target killings against ethnic Hazaras and Shia groups and other ethnic minority groups has increased. They get targeted in schools, in mosques, in hospitals, and on streets in the broad daylight without anybody really asking why or how this is happening. The Taliban have been targeting a lot of minorities in the past 20 years, and now they just have a lot more freedom in doing it without ever being questioned about it. Women's rights is another factor to look at. So these pictures are from the very first days when the Taliban came to power. And as we see that from that day one, with the Taliban's entrance to Kabul, the first impact was removal of women from public spaces. So what happened was that they installed an all-terrorist cabinet and just removed women from all sorts of leadership positions. They asked them to resign. So that's just a nicer way of saying it, but basically they just removed all women from leadership positions. Employment, women are just deprived of all sorts of employment opportunities unless it's in the health and education sector. Ministry of Women's Affairs, that's one of the ministries which had huge impact on promoting women's rights in Afghanistan and have had quite a lot of major impacts. They have abolished the whole ministry and replaced it with the Ministry of Vice and Virtue. So that's the ministry which just looks into what women can do and what women cannot do and pass on different sentences. The secondary education for girls has been banned since the day they have come, and they keep promising that they will open the school doors, but it's unknown when and why is it closed. So this is also could be a continuation of what they've done in their previous rule when education was entirely banned for girls. There are reports that the schools are open in certain parts of the country, but then there are more restrictions on their clothing. But in majority of the country, the secondary education for girls is banned. Women's mobility is way more restricted. There are laws which say that, which Taliban have passed and say that women are not allowed to travel outside the country by themselves. And also when it comes to mobility inside the city, women are expected to move around with a mahram or a male guardian and not by themselves. Shelters have been entirely removed from the country. There is no access to shelters or no existence of shelters. And just a new law which came in this Saturday, it reintroduced burqa or the face veil for women in Afghanistan. So everybody has to wear this. It's a mandatory now. And as part of this law, they have also been advised not to leave home unless it's necessary. Child marriage has grown by 500% since the Taliban came, and domestic violence in Afghanistan is at rise. This is just another graph from Vidam Institute, which shows women's mobility, women's rights comparing 2011, 2020, and 2021. And the small triangle in the middle that shows women's level of access to all sorts of property rights, freedom of movement, access to justice, and freedom from forced labor. And that shows that it's really reduced to nothing at the moment. And this also, it's important to say that this data is up until January 2022, so it doesn't include all the changes which has been made in the last 3 months, which makes the situation even worse. So here comes the million-dollar question, maybe. What lies ahead? What lies ahead for the people of Afghanistan and what lies ahead for the Taliban? So for the people of Afghanistan, or for Afghans, we are looking at worsening security situation at the moment. There are regular bomb explosions in Kabul and other major cities against ethnic minorities, but also a lot of security threats on personal level, especially those who have been previously associated with international organizations, worked with the US or European countries. They are in a lot of fear, and most of them are living in hiding at the moment. 95% of the population is at risk of starvation at the moment. The health system has collapsed entirely. At the moment, people are dying because they do not have access to medicine, or they are dying from the sort of diseases which are really, really treatable. Unemployment has increased tremendously, and it's continuing to just increase in the country. Climate change, which is another serious threat there, and global inflation with the war in Ukraine, and this inflation which is happening at the moment. So this is going to impact countries like Afghanistan even worse because of the unemployment and every other factor that we already discussed. So how has the world reacted to the situation of Afghan people now? If we just start with our neighboring countries, so Afghanistan is a country which has huge borders with Pakistan. And if we start with Pakistan, so they are one of the supporters of the Taliban, and they have quite a lot of influence in that. And they have back then they have also had their strong bases there. And they're also receiving funding from this country. And once this, the Taliban government was installed in Kabul, so following that, what Pakistan has did for the people of Afghanistan, that it increased even the most basic things, such as a visa fee, for example. So before Pakistan visa was free for the people of Afghanistan, but now people pay up to $800 just to get a visa. It's the same with their tickets, air tickets, and a lot of other things, which just got worse since the Taliban took over. The other neighboring country is Iran. That's also not a big fan of Afghans, in the sense that it keeps deporting a lot of Afghans every day, and the number of deportees is 5,000 per day, and it's even continuing to get worse and worse. They also treat Afghans with a lot of discrimination inside the country, and those who live inside, a lot of them do not have access to even most basic human rights inside the country. Europe and US. So what they have done so far is, especially following the war in Ukraine, so a lot of attention has been just given to Ukraine, in the sense that Afghans have been forgotten by a lot of people across Europe and US, or if they have not been forgotten, they just come as the second priority, not as the first anymore. And what they're trying to do is, they keep saying that we can soften the Taliban, or we can push them to get moderated or change their behavior or to accept. But this is just the wrong focus, because if we look at the Taliban, it's just a terrorist group who knows nothing but how to just kill their own people. That's their history, and that's what they've been doing over the past 20 years. What do you expect of such a group to, like, how can they govern a whole nation with that background? And then there is China and Russia. There is a small small border between China and Afghanistan. They have already received the diplomats from Afghanistan. So there is kind of relationship between them, but it's also said that because of this border or closeness that we have, so it could be more threat for China if there is any security, if there is any war or any other major changes in Afghanistan, so that would not benefit China. And then Russia has huge influence on the northern part of Afghanistan and countries such as Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. So it has quite a lot of interest in the country as well, just because of its closeness to these countries. And what lies ahead for the Taliban? So the big question would be, is the world gonna accept them and give them legitimacy and recognition? One approach would be what the US and majority of the European countries are pushing for at the moment, that maybe they are going to change eventually, they're going to soften their approach, they're going to get moderated, and yes, we're going to help them. So that would mean that we are going to just accept to live with the rule of terror in the country and accept these kind of people as the new normal in Afghanistan. And the second part would be no. So that would mean that Taliban would get even more isolated, and they would continue to just fund themselves through, for example, drugs and those kind of illegal things, which would benefit them quite a lot, which they might be able to sustain themselves, but then it might really be more tricky for the entire region. The other thing which is talked a lot about is civil war in Afghanistan. Right now, as we speak, there are strong resistance movements in Panjshir, which is a smaller province in Afghanistan, going on. There are war crimes committed by the Taliban. They're killing children and civilians because there is the National Resistance Front just launching attacks against them. This has been going on for a few days now, and it just has escalated and since yesterday. So the question is that how strong this National Resistance Front is going to get, and how many people are going to join them, and what's going to happen to them. So if they are going to get stronger, there is a possibility of a civil war in Afghanistan as well. And with all of this, also the ISIS and Khorasan province, Islamic State of Khorasan province, they are also gaining ground, so they get to recruit more people. And there are also reports which say that people who have been working with the former Afghan army, they're joining this group just because they're so scared of just to maintain their own security, and in order to avoid joining the Taliban. So if they grow, that would also mean that the whole region would be insecure in the longer term, and maybe there would be need for foreign intervention in the longer term. How can we help? So these are some of the questions that I get asked often. So how can we help? I would say in the personal level, there are ways that we could still help. The advocacy, that's really important on social media. Sometimes we tend to underestimate the power of social media, but it is important. Taliban have used it effectively. It has worked so much, and we could use it too. It's important to advocate for the people of Afghanistan, for minorities in Afghanistan, and for women's rights and women's education in Afghanistan. Let's not forget them. If you have the possibility, you could donate to different organizations which are active in Afghanistan, and some of the organizations who work with Afghanistan or who have worked with Afghanistan over years. It's important to know that UN and a lot of international organizations in this level, when they send food and other supplies to Afghanistan, it doesn't always reach the poor. At first, it has to get through some layer, some source of, it will get handed over to the Taliban before it reaches the poor. And then there are various levels of discrimination before this is divided. This just gets distributed to the people. So it's important, really important, to find some organizations that we trust and donate so it reaches the actual people. It's also on the policy level, there are some work which could be done, and that is funding sources for the Taliban. Countries like Pakistan who actively support terrorism, the world should, it's time for the world to sanction Pakistan. If there's a number of sanctions which is on Russia, if even half of it was on Pakistan, maybe Afghanistan wouldn't be in the place where it is today. So it's important to just stop their funding sources and put pressure on those countries. Countries with feminist foreign policies such as Sweden, Canada, it's time for them to step up, because if there is one thing which is important when it comes to women's rights, and if there are countries who could put pressure and should put pressure, this is the time. What does a feminist foreign policy for these countries mean if they're not stepping up for the women of Afghanistan now? And the other recommendation would be for these countries, especially for the US and Europe, don't play by the Taliban rules. So what we see on majority of the things going on, so on social media, if we see the delegates, US delegates, European delegates, they go and meet the Taliban and then post their selfies smiling with them. And what kind of message does that send? It's not really, you are not meeting with any normal democratically elected leaders. You're meeting with a group who is ruling their people by terror, and they have forcefully taken the power there. So just, they shouldn't really play by their rules. When they go and meet them, they should send women delegates instead of just sending a whole all-men group of delegates because they're meeting the Taliban. So the more they play by the Taliban rules, the more leverage they're giving them, and the worse the situation for Afghans become. So that would be my advice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nazifa. So here's how we will proceed. Let me maybe get the ball rolling a little bit by sharing some of my initial reactions to Nazifa's presentation, and also ask you some questions. I mean, again, of course, thank you very much for this very wonderful talk. And as I said, I mean, we don't actually have lots of experts here in Taiwan on Afghanistan, and you do bring us a very great talk with insights and also your personal observations. So I guess let me quickly ask two questions. The first one is, you mentioned, of course, in your analysis of the kind of origin of this, the beginning of this withdrawal, which is the corruption of the government. And I do wonder, from your personal perspective, I mean, there has been some debate in the literature on foreign aid, and so people, long time ago, especially Western countries, thought that would be a nice solution to some of the issues for developing countries, and but for a long time, since that people have reflected on that question and try to rethink the usefulness of foreign aid. So in the context of Afghanistan, do you think that's in Afghan case? Do you think foreign aid might also be one of the contributing factors to the final kind of the corruption of the government, also the eventual failure of the U.S. Role in the country? And what's your thoughts on that? And also related to Taiwan, I mean, this is probably the question that people here will be greatly concerned about. So actually, what happened in Afghanistan last year, did have some global repercussion. And here in Taiwan, even though, as I said, I mean, no, I suppose people here may not be that familiar with the region, but one very relevant factor out of that scenario is the American commitment to the security of Taiwan. And this is, of course, a huge issue here, and the people have all kinds of different views on it. And since the withdrawal, and especially at the moment, then here there seems to be some disinformation or conspiracy theory campaign here. Of course, it's hard to identify the exact sources of those disinformation, but apparently this is a very partisan here in Taiwan. And some people would take the example of the Afghanistan scenario as the evidence showing that, well, basically Americans are not to be trusted. So if there's anything happening here across the Taiwan Strait, the United States would basically do the same thing. And of course, this is also something we have witnessed from the Ukrainian scenario. So I guess I know you're not, of course, not an expert on Taiwan or the region, but I was just wondering what your thought might be regarding this, disinformation campaign, and especially this is also, of course, an important issue for the VDEN Institute, of which I'm also a part of. According to my recent studies, actually, including the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, also as well as the current role the United States and other Western powers are playing in the Ukrainian scenario. Well, it seems that, I mean, here we do have a pattern here in Taiwan, especially, in our political landscape. Some people basically would kind of buy into the conspiracy theory that Americans are not to be trusted, and they would actually just leave anyway when that kind of scenario happens. But so I wonder, in Afghanistan context, do you have any like useful indicators for assessing the American commitments? So that would be, of course, that's a big question, but I was wondering, what your thought might be. And I suppose our audience also have other questions and ideas to share as well. So I guess I'll stop here and then let you kind of respond briefly to my questions, and then we will open the floor to our participants online.
Yeah, sure. So if we start with the first question, has foreign aid also contributed to the huge corruption in Afghanistan and consequently the failure of the Afghan government and Taliban taking over again? I would say the answer would be both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there was just a lot of money poured into the country, but then not a lot of it was just without any sort of plan on what this money should be spent on. Yeah, there was this huge, unclear, vague, ambitious goal of we built the country or we democratized the country. But what does it actually mean in the context? How does the context work? There was really little knowledge by many of these international organizations on the ground. So they have just poured in the money and then did run micro projects here and there, but then majority of these projects did not really work in the long run because they were so dependent on this fund. And the moment the fund just gets stopped, then the project dies. So there was no really longer term solution to most of the projects which were run there by the international funding, especially in the civil society level. So it did contribute positively to some extent, but then there was no sustainability to most of it. So I would say it did contribute positively, but then longer term plans did not really exist, and that contributed to its failure eventually as well. And also the other part would be that a lot of this money came into Afghanistan. International organizations say that they brought this much money, but I personally would be a lot suspicious of that as well. It's true that the Afghan government was corrupt, but then there is a lot of corruption on the international level when it comes to aid as well. How much of this money has come to Afghanistan? How much of this money did not come to Afghanistan, but they said that it will come? And what happened in the process? There are quite a lot of delegates who just come through this international aid to Afghanistan, spent lavishly, and we need to really look into the breakdown of what has happened to all this money. So if we look at some of the project breakdowns in really smaller parts, for example, international organizations come to Afghanistan, have an office, spend a lot of money on a lot of lavish things which do not really make a difference eventually for the project. They spend a lot on airfare, on a lot of big hotels, those kind of things. But then when it comes to the impact, then it's really difficult to evaluate what they've done there. So I would say that it has contributed a lot to the failure of it, in the sense that the money was there. It said that it will come into the country, but then the plan was not there. Or maybe there was this big goal, but then it was never really broken down into smaller parts, and they never really decided what to do with it, who takes responsibility for every step. There was never an evaluation of, okay, where are we in this goal? So it did contribute in so many ways, but it did also have some positive impacts. For example, I am one of the people who did not live under the Taliban, the previous Taliban rule, but then we went back to Afghanistan once this whole US occupation happened. And during the past 20 years, there were quite a lot of me and those of my generation who have gone to school, who have studied, thanks to a lot of this international funding that was there. And sometimes when I think some of the people of my generation, we might not have been able to go to school if there weren't this international funding, or the school that we went to, for example, might not even existed. And this is just one minor example. So this was needed, the money was needed there, the international funding was needed, but then it wasn't really spent in the way it was. So it did contribute to a lot of corruption, but then it did have some positive impact as well, I would say. Does that answer the question? Or?
Oh yeah, thank you. I mean, so do you have also any response to the disinformation question raised?
Sure. I think if I answer this question, as you said, I'm not an expert when it comes to Taiwan, but when it comes to Afghanistan, as an Afghan, I would say that an average Afghan would not trust the US with their presence in Afghanistan anymore. Mm-hmm. So when US attacked Afghanistan in 2001, what it said was that we are going to save the women in Afghanistan. That was what they started the war with. That's how they justified their whole attack. They went there, and then now Afghan women are exactly back where they were, and the situation is not getting any better under the Taliban. So what happened to this whole thing? Was it just a mere word to just convince the world that we're going to attack this country? Was it just a way to justify their occupation? This is just a very basic example, and that's exactly why we do not trust them anymore. Also, the way they left, and as I just said in my presentation, somebody who spends that much money in a country, and then by looking at the timeline, the fall of the government was just so predictable. How could they just be so indifferent to the outcome of it? So is it that you go to a country when there is your interest, but then you leave it whenever you want without even paying attention to what happens to the people there, and you just betray them like that? I would say as an average Afghan would not really trust the US and their occupation anymore. And the support for the US government has just reduced so much among different layers of the society.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you very much for sharing this, your view on this. Okay, so I guess we might have other questions from our audience. So now I'm going to open the floor to all the participants. If you have any questions, please raise your hands, or you can type in the chat box, and I'll read the questions for you. So okay, so there's a question here. It was a long question, several questions here. So Nazifa, can you read it?
Yes.
So maybe let me read it out loud, maybe for other participants as well. So the first question is, following up on Professor Tong's question on foreign aid, with the Taliban's reversal on girls' education, will the Taliban's reversal on girls' education have aid consequences? That's the first question. And the second question is, well, in March 2020, ICC authorized the prosecutor's request to investigate into the alleged war crimes covering the Afghan forces, the US troops, CIA operatives, and the Taliban armed group in Afghanistan. In September 2021, however, the newly sworn-in ICC prosecutor decided to exclude US from Afghanistan war crimes investigation. How have all of these, both ongoing war crime investigation and exclusion of alleged crime committed by the US, been perceived by the Afghan public and political community? What are some implications? So the second one is pretty long.
Yeah, thank you. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Serena, for your question. For the first question, I would say by reversal, you mean once they announced that the girls' schools will be opened at the beginning of the educational year, which was in March. And then in March, when the girls went to school, the school doors did not really open, and they just sent back the secondary level girls back to their homes without any announcement of when the school is going to be opened and why it's not opened. I think it's tricky in the sense that, so when it comes to aid, a lot of it, what it covers at the moment is for example, the health sector, which is quite a failure, and then the education, the remaining schools which are open, so the salaries for the teachers, and then quite a lot of those kind of things which impact ordinary people on their day-to-day lives. So I wouldn't say this would impact that, because so if we look from the perspective of Germany and Holland, who are funding quite a lot of these operations in Afghanistan at the moment, when it comes to the health and education sector. So if they just draw back that because they're not opening the schools for girls, what impact does it have for Afghans in all of these households? It's not going to impact any of them positively anymore. I think rather than an exchange, it's better to see this. I would personally want these governments to just put pressure on them to open it and do not make any further progress with them until they really open the girls' school and make all these changes and just to reverse all these restrictions that they have put on Afghan women. I think the more they sit and negotiate with them and just tell them, okay, what do you want? They're just giving them more and more leverage, and it's not going to stop them from demanding more. So they just keep receiving what they want without even giving up anything. Understand that they gave up something without, I'm not saying that the aid, because that really, it has a lot of impact on normal people in the country. But then in so many other ways, there is so much that the world could do and put pressure on them and not see this as an exchange of this for that, both of which are important to the normal people in Afghanistan. And then in second part, maybe this is also connected to what we already talked about when it comes to trusting the US government. For Afghans, just because we have seen so much of this, and as I also said in my presentation, a lot of Afghans have been killed in US airstrikes, including a lot of children, without anybody ever questioning them or without them even saying sorry for everything they have done to the people of Afghanistan and killing them just like that. So I think it has impacted Afghans and their perspective of the US quite a lot, and this contributes to this mistrust as well, because it's not just the Taliban killing Afghan people, it's the US killing Afghan people as well. So for so many people, they're like, especially those who have been living in rural areas, if we talk to them directly, for some of them, they say that for us, it doesn't really matter if the Taliban rule or if the government rules or if the US rules or if a US-backed government rules, because for us, it's just the same. We will get killed by one or the other, and there is just war no matter who rules. So one side, we will just give sacrifices. So that's just the situation, and I'm saying that this does not really contribute any positive to everything which they have done as well.
Oh, thank you. And we welcome other questions from the audience. Anyone? Okay, so we have here a question from Professor Ho. I will unmute you.
Hello, my name is Patrick. I'm from a university on a very small island. So I feel very fortunate to have such an opportunity to listen to Miss I'm sorry, how should I pronounce your name? Alizada. I'm sorry for being so rude or not knowing how to pronounce it properly. But I do have two very short questions because you mentioned that the parliament was divided and the politicians in your country were corrupted. So who were those politicians? I mean, what were their social backgrounds, those politicians? And my second question is about, with hindsight, what would be the more useful type of leadership for the construction of your country after the US invasion? Or should I put it another way, that what would be the suitable type of coalition of political or other kind of elites or economically elites, the necessary coalition of elites for the development of your country back to the US occupied era? So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Ho.
Yeah.
Very good friend of mine.
Sorry. Yeah, no, thank you so much for your questions. First question, so the parliament was divided, and what I meant by that is that, so in Afghanistan, if we just study the demography, it's a country which is, it has two national languages, 4 ethnic groups who all have some sort of power struggle among themselves. It's the Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras. And then there are also 2 sects of Islam, Shia and Sunni. And all of these play a huge role when it comes to power sharing and forming a government and how the power is distributed across different agencies. So in Afghanistan, over the course of history, power has always been at the hands of Pashtuns, who are the major group there. They are the dominant. They're the group who speak Pashto and then have the practice. Most of them practice the Sunni sect of Islam, which distinguishes them from the rest. So the others, they do have quite some common things with each other, like language. For example, Hazaras and Tajiks, they speak mostly Persian, but then it's again divided because Hazaras mostly practice Shia sect of Islam, while Tajiks, most of them would practice Sunni sect of Islam again. So it is these kind of divisions which makes it more difficult for a government to just put them together and just build a government in so many other contexts which are more of with the same ethnic people of the same ethnic roots, I would say. And also, based on all of this, there has been this history of persecution of minority groups. For example, Hazaras, they have been persecuted over hundreds of years in Afghanistan by different kings, by other ethnic groups in Afghanistan who were the kings. So this is this historical suffering, historical kind of struggle and discrimination against this group, which makes it difficult for them to trust their Pashtun fellows in Afghanistan when it comes to power sharing and distribution of power. And then it's the same. And then we had this huge civil war, which happened right before the former Taliban government. And there are just so many people of different ethnic groups who committed a lot of war crimes against each other. They killed each other, and they have there are so many of them who still hold a lot of grudges because of all of those. So, and that's not in personal level, that's quite a lot, and big government making level. And later on, once the US came, what they did was that they brought all these warlords from these different ethnic groups, telling that, okay, we have these 4 ethnic groups, we have these languages, and then we have this sect. So we bring the leaders of these ethnic groups, and then we form a government. So what they did was they brought a lot of warlords together back to the table and put them in charge of the government, but which eventually just led to a lot of weaknesses on different levels as well, because it's true that representation is important, but then a lot of other things should be taken into account when you form a government as well. So it's the same with the parliament as well. So the parliament, it has some sort of quota over different ethnic groups, and it is decided based on various provinces. So who gets how many seats based on which province you come from. And people, when they vote, a lot of them vote based on ethnicity as well. So a Hazara, for example, would tend to often vote for a Hazara, or a Pashtun tends to often vote for a Pashtun, or a Tajik often tends to vote for a Tajik. So that is the sort of representation which then comes into play in parliament as well. And then they're also inside the house when a law wants to be passed, or any sort of thing which is into motion, if they're voting, they again are playing their ethnic cards there. So there is no unified power or any other ideology just which plays there. It's a lot of this ethnic and this kind of backgrounds which is into play very actively there, and just influences the decisions and decision making quite a lot in the government level. And the second question, if I understood it right, so you are asking what sort of coalition would have been good to rule the country with?
Yes, that would be my question. Thank you. That's the question.
Yeah, so I think from my point of view, so do you mean mostly instead of what the US has done, or right now in the situation now?
When the US occupied Afghanistan. So with hindsight, what would the Afghan people be better off had there been the right type of leadership, or the right type of coalition of leaders or elites?
I think what happened in Afghanistan, so with the way the government was formed, now a lot of Afghans would not agree with me, but I personally think that the way that the government was formed, it wasn't the problem. The problem in the government was that the power was so centralized. So probably we should do something about that, so that not one single individual would have so much power over decision making in a whole country. So one day the president wakes up and says, okay, I'm changing this thing in the country. And that just happens without anybody having a say on that. We should really work on decentralizing the power and bringing it to lower levels as well, so that other bodies of the government are involved in the decision making and their votes makes a difference, kind of. So maybe the form of the government is not the problem, it's more the centralization of power which is the problem.
I see. Thank you very much.
We have another question from the chat box. What is your projected future of Afghanistan in a short-term sense in a post-US era?
It's so difficult to say. As I said in my presentation, I don't personally see any bright future for the country, unfortunately. Maybe there is bright inside, quote unquote, future for the Taliban, that in the longer term, maybe somehow they will manage to gain legitimacy, and then there will be funding from IMF and World Bank and any other organization, and treat them as any normal government, and that way they would sustain, which will be their ideal scenario case. But then that would also mean that the oppression for the general people, for women, minority, human rights, everything will just worsen in the country, and that's not really a bright future either. So I'm not so positive, and if they don't give them legitimacy, the situation doesn't seem any bright either, because there could be civil war, there could be more isolation for the Taliban, and then maybe there would be another North Korea just operating by themselves, being there and then living on the oppression of their people. I'm sorry, but there is no bright future there from my point of view, from where we stand.
Other questions from our audience? Okay, so here's another one. Let me maybe take this question from this is Mr. Hoda Fakur, and then we have other questions from the chat box.
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh yeah, Mrs. Sorry.
Yes,
please,
that's me.
Please. Yeah,
thank you.
okay.
Thank you very much. Hello, and thank you very much, Ms. Nazifa, for your presentation. My name is Hoda Fakur, and I'm sure that you can realize that based on my name, that I'm from your neighbor country. I'm Iranian, and I'm a faculty member, assistant professor in Changchun Christian University. I'm very glad that I have the chance to listen to your presentation. The time that I knew that you were going to have this presentation, I just instantly registered my name to be there here. As a person who is living in the region, as you know, we all know many things about the Middle East, and these two countries have had a long history along each other's. I personally respect a lot our neighbors, Afghans, and I know there has been a lot of problems challenging for both neighbors, both peoples everywhere. But my point is, I have viewpoints about this, and I would like to hear from your side as well. I think the Afghanistan's problem, although the Taliban's is a main challenge here, but I think the problem is the core of the problem is not necessarily on the like violent force like Taliban's who came over to control the country. I think the problem came when the President Ghani, who was the president of Afghanistan at that time, whenever he was about to take the role, he was not living in a country at that time. He came from New York to take the role of presidency. So what I mean is, what people can realize from the situation is those people who are in charge, who were actually in charge of controlling the country, they were not actually they were not fully aware of the situations among the peoples and the cultures. And my question, or what I really want to know your viewpoints on this is, what do you think is the role of educated people at the current situation? As long as I know, like, same to Iran also, I think many educated people in Afghanistan, they left the country for better opportunities or maybe for the brighter future. So it could be one of the points that makes Afghanistan to reach to this point, because of living or having lack of available educated peoples who stay in the country and fight for the human rights and the developing of the country. So what do you think is the role of educated people nowadays for facing or making the better future for the Afghans? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Hoda, for your question. I think first question concerning Ashraf Ghani. So it's true that usually when we just bring people from outside and just expect them to do the right thing in a country, they know nothing about the context, it will not really work. But for Ashraf Ghani, that wasn't really the case, because he has served the Afghan government during the first president. So during Hamid Karzai, he has worked as a minister. And then following that, he also was the dean of Kabul University. So he has been in Afghanistan for quite some time before his presidency. And very ironically, his educational background also played a role in him winning the presidential election, at least the next years, because for majority of the younger people, when we compared Ashraf Ghani and his opponent, it was that at least he is well educated. He has written books. He is an academic, so he is much better. And a lot of us just counted on his background in his education, and but maybe that's not always a factor when it comes to politics as well. Concerning the role of educated people in rebuilding Afghanistan as of now, I would go with the last points that I suggested. I think for educated people, it's really difficult to be in the country at the moment. I do have a lot of contacts who are left behind, and they are well educated and they come from quite rich backgrounds, but then there is no opportunity available for them, and there is no room for them to have any sort of activity, in the sense that they have either worked with the previous government or they have worked with some sort of international or national organization which all of their ideologies is against the Taliban and is not accepted by the Taliban. So that already is a trait for those people personally and just limits their activities so much. And then on the other hand, so one of the ministers of the Taliban, the first day when he came, he was like, we cannot expect anything from the people who got educated over the past 20 years. Like, they do not really count on what educated people have learned. So within their government, there is not much the educated people could do. What they accept is as proper education as the religious education that most of them have received in Pakistan and a lot of other Arabic countries, but then that's not something that majority of the people who can make a difference in Afghanistan, they have studied, or that's not the only way to go about it. So if we say education as in religious education, then they could work under the Taliban, and I'm not sure, but I'm not so positive in working within the Taliban or under their rule, or as they say, just making a difference from inside, because that I personally don't see how that's going to work. It's not any normal autocratic or theocracy regime. We are talking about a terrorist group here who barely give opportunities to anybody else, and they don't hesitate for a second time to kill anybody if they just see the minimum trait in that person. So I don't really see how educated people could really work from Afghanistan within that body. But for those of us who are educated and who are abroad, there is just so much we could do. As I mentioned, advocacy is one part. We could write, we could raise awareness. We could also mobilize, and those of us who have better contacts maybe put pressure on our governments, and those of us, for example, diaspora communities abroad, Afghan diaspora communities who have the right to vote in other countries, they could put a lot of pressure on their politicians to put pressure on the Taliban in Afghanistan to make a difference. So I would say there are still things to do, but maybe not as possible from inside as one could wish for.
Well, thank you. I have a quick follow-up question. So, kind of based on Mrs. Fakour's question, well, I guess by education, you probably mean the secular education, right? And you do mention, even though, I mean, the way in which you describe or characterize Taliban is more like it's a terrorist group. But I suppose, I wonder actually if, I suppose during this 10 years, American occupation, the kind of education the government put forward would be some kind of secular education, promoting human rights and women's rights included. So do you think there is any kind of societal resistance to that? If, not necessarily you put Taliban aside. I mean, in the African society, is there any resistance to that kind of secular education in itself?
So when you say secular education, that means entirely taking away religion and just teaching everything else. And I think in the Afghan context, I wouldn't say that's happening. So what I meant by education in Afghanistan, for example, in the school that I went, or if we even start broadly with the constitution, it says Afghanistan is an Islamic country and everything happening in this country should be according to Islamic rules. But then how broadly do we define? That's the older constitution from the Republic. The Taliban are not following that anymore, so just to mention. But so during the previous 20 years, the education which was there, for example, Holy Quran, that was part of the school education, students got taught, but that didn't really mean that students did not study other subjects like human rights or social sciences or a lot of other things which are important when it comes to democratization. So I would say that when it comes to the context of education in Afghanistan, it's not necessarily to really take away religion from the context, because religion can become a problem if you make it a problem, but then it can also help positively in so many other ways as well. So you could use it as a tool for the good or for the bad. And I would say in the previous Afghan government, it was there because it's part of the culture, it's part of the identity of Afghans, but it wasn't harming the people because people were studying it just as a religion on the side, as any other subject. But then, when we go to university as well, there is the whole entire department for it. So people who want to study religious studies, they can study it. But then there are other possibilities as well. But under the Taliban, when we talk about religion, I don't think their interpretation of religion is exactly what we had during the Republic of Afghanistan. So that's also an important distinction to make.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we have another question here in the chat box from Mrs. Mina Liao. So the question is, I would like to ask that since the troop withdrawal of the U.S. is actually a long-term problem, however, President Biden's decision to led to the current situation in Afghanistan, then when should be the right time for the U.S. IS to withdraw the troops without causing what? So do you mean U.S.? Sorry. Oh yeah, typo. So what should be the right time for the U.S. to withdraw the troops without causing what's happening right now?
I think the fact that they withdrew, that wasn't the problem on itself. But the fact that they sat with Taliban, signed the Doha deal, brought them to international spotlight, gave them a lot of promises behind the closed doors and without involving the Afghan government in the process, or without asking the people of Afghanistan what they want, I think that's where the problem is. So maybe they could withdraw, and they did not really sign this deal with the Taliban. So the Taliban would not be as optimistic that they're going to be part of the Afghan government once the US leaves. So it is that what US did was not only withdraw at this time, they also gave a lot of promises to the Taliban that they would be involved in the government, that they are receiving a lot of benefits, and so much else, which is just unknown, and they have just discussed in Doha without disclosing a lot of those details. So I would say it wasn't the withdrawal itself which was the problem, or it wasn't the timing. I think that's part of that speech that you're referring to. So Biden has also said that we could have left in 15 years and the same thing might have happened. But I would say, no, this might not have happened in 15 years, because by then, a lot of the new generation would be already in the government, and the quality of governance would improve a lot, because Afghanistan was getting back on its feet quite a lot, and there were so many changes since 2001. That would be one factor, and the other factor would be that US did not really need to sign that deal with Taliban behind the Afghan government's back. So that was the biggest betrayal they have done to the Afghan government and to the people of Afghanistan. And that was where this went wrong, I think.
Thank you. So we have another question from Mrs. Wang Yujin.
Hello, hi. Okay, greeting from Taipei. I live in Gothenburg for 18 months. So that's very, so I know a little bit about Sweden society. My question is about migration and refugee. That was what was Swedish society is going to have a long-term policy for that. Because I compare with Germany, because I also live in Germany for more than 10 years. And I found they for the migration or refugee, this input for the million in the past 5 years, since 2015. And I think Germany is doing a good job by integrating those refugees from the Middle East and Syria. Okay, so what about Sweden? As I know, Swedish society actually has the most, I think they take in the most refugee in comparison with the population of Swedish population, about 800 more million, but in Germany there are 18 million. So Sweden actually take in the most the refugee from Syria. So what about the migration and the conflict in the society? Would you get something of your observation? And maybe what about the long-term perspective for Scandinavian country taking in those refugees from the Middle East? Yes, please.
Thank you.
So if I just bring this question to the context of this presentation. So I think Sweden has taken a lot of Afghan refugees in 2015 when the whole Syria situation was going on, and quite a lot of Afghans together with Syrians, Iraqis, and people from the Middle East crossed the Mediterranean Sea and entered Sweden. So as part of them was also quite a lot of unaccompanied minors who came here. There have been quite a lot of struggle and debates over how the migration should be, whether we should accept them, whether we should not accept them. And back then, Afghanistan was considered, a majority of the Afghan cities were considered safe by Sweden. So they were like, there is no need to give asylum to these people. So there were quite a lot of migration issues in front of these refugees. But in the context of 2021, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan again, Afghans were not really left with many legal options to come to Sweden or Germany or a lot of European countries entirely. So the common way for majority of the Afghans before was taking the Mediterranean route and just illegally crossing border to border until they reached the destination they wanted. But right now, first of all, crossing into Iran and then to Turkey, there are so many layers of which stop them on the way, so it's not really possible. And then people would be stuck in Greece for so many years as well, because now Greece is having its own refugee camps there, and the situation is really horrible there. So people are not really taking that route anymore in the context of 2021, despite everything the Taliban are putting them through. Also, this route is really expensive and costly, and as we saw in the context of Afghanistan, 95% are struggling with just finding food to survive. So sponsoring these kind of trips, it's really costly and nearly impossible for most of the people. In terms of other sort of evacuations, so Sweden particularly, they have brought 1,200 people. They have evacuated or sent airplanes and brought people directly here. Majority of whom were people who have worked with the Swedish forces before, or those who were sort of associated with different civil society organizations active in Afghanistan by Sweden. And there were quite a lot of human rights activists as well who were evacuated to Sweden. And I wouldn't say they have, unlike what, for example, Sweden or Germany has for Ukraine. So when people come, they directly receive a lot of benefits from the government, and then they receive their immediate permission to leave here and continue with their lives. It's not that way for Afghans. Majority of the Afghans have long waiting periods until they go through an interview. So just because they got evacuated by the Swedish government from Kabul to Sweden, it doesn't grant them the residence permit here. They still have to go through the interviews and explain the reasons why they need asylum. The Swedish Migration Agency makes a decision, and only then they will be either receive a positive or negative decision. So it's not as easy as it is for the people of Ukraine here, who just come here, start with their lives, and have their status already.
Okay, I think we have time for the final question here. So could you please give some observations that you have about the Afghanistan universities in terms of how they are impacted by the Taliban rule? Does a female employment ban also apply to university female faculty members?
The university, the biggest university or the biggest public university, which was Kabul University, it was closed for a few weeks in the beginning. But then what Taliban have done was that they said that they want a total segregation in the universities in Afghanistan. And initially what they started with was, and also that what that means is that there is no co-education system in the universities anymore, because that was the system. So in the university level, then girls and boys, they study together, but in schools it is separate. So we have girls' schools and then we have boys' schools. So they have tried to stop that, and then they also say that when it comes to lecturers, so only female lecturers would lecture the female students and male lecturers would lecture the male students, which makes it impossible in the sense that, first of all, there was a shortage of female lecturers in the university level even during the former government. And with all these evacuations, quite a lot of educated people who were active in those sectors, they just left the country. So that means that we are even more short on the number of lecturers and qualified people on that front. So that means that we do not have enough female lecturers to just lecture the female students. And that would, in a different word, mean that there wouldn't be an education in the university level for females in the longer run. They have applied the same rule to the private universities as well, but we aren't really sure how long they can sustain, especially that most of these private universities also are quite dependent on the tuition fee they collect from students, and with the poverty, unemployment, and everything that's going on in the country, the prospects do not seem so bright for these private universities either. And maybe I should also add that there were, for example, Faculty of Fine Arts and Music and those kind of things that the Taliban banned entirely.
Okay, I guess I'm sorry to report that the time is up. So I guess I myself also have lots of other questions I would like to ask, and I guess so do you. But this is the design of the event, and I guess we definitely would invite Nazifa to come back to this kind of event again. And so let's thank Nazifa for spending the time with us today. And even though this is not in person, so we cannot give you a big applause, but I think everyone is thanking Nazifa from their own place. Okay, so thank you, Nazifa, again. And then I suppose I'll see you in the near future very soon. And also thank everyone for taking part in today's events. Thank you very much. See you very soon next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.